Welcome everybody joining us on YouTube if you're watching us live from there, and all of you here on the Zoom meeting, and a few of you are still trickling in. So we're going to, for the next couple of minutes, that's always the first thing we do is to share the slide with all our co-sponsors, those who have helped us make this class possible, and also to thank all of you who have made donations, whatever the amount, as patrons of this course. And I see a lot of conversations happening on the Facebook, on the private Facebook page. If you are a patron, you are included in that Facebook page, and you can watch a lot of great conversations have happened. And if you're not yet a patron, just go to the BDS website. On the left side, you'll find a way to participate, donate. I don't exactly remember what the drop down menu is. You'll find your way there, and then under donate, just scroll down and type anti-racism class, anti-Semitism class, and as soon as you do that, we'll send you the link to the private Facebook page. And thank you for being a sponsor and maybe a partner in this. And if you made a donation maybe at the beginning of a few dollars, maybe this class has moved your soul enough to maybe want to re-up, whatever. Anything is a blessing for the work we do here. Okay, I think that was good, and we're going to come back together. I see a few more people have joined us since that. And I want to invite us into a Shalom Chant as we begin this evening together. And just a short meditation, maybe, if you want to call it that, just a moment to be with ourselves, maybe close our eyes, and just take a few mindful breaths. Letting go of the day that was, and just finding ourselves here, right now, together in a community of learners. And from this center, from this place within ourselves of calmness and centeredness, we call the word shalom, which means peace, of course, but shalom also means wholeness. Shalom means completeness. Shalom means harmony. And so those are the kind of energies that we are calling out to infuse this class tonight as we chant together. Or just listen, whatever works for you. יהיו לרצון עם רפי והגיון ליבי לפניך, אדוני. Holy One of Being, Holy One who expresses as and through every being, each and every one of us. Help us to know your presence in this space between us tonight. Help us to know or remember that we are the embodiment of your vitality, your grace, your compassion, your love, your embrace. That the meditations of our heart, the words of our mouth might just flow from that ground, that fullness, the center of your being. Holy One. Adonai Tzuri v'Go'ali, Holy One, you are source, and you are liberator. Amen. Okay, we have, I know I say that every night, but we have a lot to cover tonight in a very challenging and intense topic, as have been all the weeks leading up to this one. So I will do my best, I promise, to get us to 8:30, but this is one of the nights where we, please brace yourself and bear with me, might go a little bit beyond. This is a very challenging, I just say that, but I want to reiterate that. And I want to take the time it takes to really go in the depth of it so that we can get the most out of our time together. The topic for tonight, as I mentioned last week as we finished last week's session, is the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, sanctions, allegedly, as we will see, allegedly aimed at Israel. So here's where I want to start. I want to start with sharing with you a hodgepodge of documented accusations that are mostly swirling around the political left in America today, on university campuses and other left progressive spaces. And here is an assortment of those. Israel is an illegitimate, non-democratic country. A state should not be founded on religious identity. It is an anachronism. It's an anachronic. It's racist. Another one. Jews don't belong there. Running everything. I want you to hear what's underneath that, right? Running everything. Jews don't belong there. Running everything. Another one. Zionism is what's at the heart of the problem. You Zionists have got to recognize that Israel is a colonizing state. Another one. If you can't accept the truth about Israel and Zionism, you're not a progressive. Another one. We can never have a conversation about Israel in this country because you all control the media, you all control Congress and American foreign policy. Besides, the Jewish lobby always gets what it wants. Just a few highlights. People who throw these accusations around, as I have mentioned previously, but it's worth repeating, use words like Israelis, Jews, and Zionists completely interchangeably. Most don't have the slightest idea of what Zionism was, and of the history of the Jews in the Middle East altogether. And so they easily conclude that if Israel is a Jewish state, it must de facto be racist and a colonialist enterprise. And what proceeds from these mixed accusations is the rise in support of the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, sanction, allegedly against Israel. It is critical to understand the history of the BDS movement, as it is critical to understand its actual goals. And I want to spend most of the time tonight making this very clear. And I hope I will succeed. Historically, the BDS movement against Israel was founded in 2005, not so long ago, by several Palestinian organizations who came together. And it's not a surprise because, as we have seen when I talked about anti-Semitism in the Arab world, as we have seen, this was just, we could say, the latest version of many Arab-sponsored boycotts going back decades, even in the pre-state era of the Jewish community that lived under British-controlled Palestine in the first decade, almost 2 decades of the 20th century, which those boycotts targeted at the time international supporters of the Zionist movement and Jews in general. This version of this Palestinian-sponsored latest BDS movement has 3 goals according to its stated goals on its platform. 1, boycotting Israeli-made products and services, as well as public events in which Israeli participate. 2, divestment by private institutions of investments in Israeli companies. And 3, the establishment of international sanctions against Israel. Now understand, this is a Palestinian effort to strike at Israel. So at its core, I would say, those are tools of warfare which are in the state of conflict between Israel and the Palestinian people, are tools of warfare. If we are at war, everybody fights with what they have. Palestinian organizations are at war with Israel, most of them are, and short of being able to have a fighting army to try and defeat Israel, they use all the means at their disposal to try and harm Israel as much as they can. So this is not necessarily anti-Semitism. It's not necessarily anti-Semitic. This is war, right? We have 2 people at war with each other. And you use the tactics as Palestinians that you have at your disposal. It's just the same. It's not exactly the same, but it's very much akin to when America imposes economic sanctions on Russia, let's say for invading Crimea, as an act of retaliation short of open conflict, right? And so Palestinian organizations try to influence mass media, mass populations in the Western world, that they might compel their respective governments to do basically what the US does against Russia, but in this case against Israel. One of the goals as expressed in the Palestinian BDS platform is, and I quote, to punish Israel's apartheid policies toward Israeli and Palestinian Arabs. Another is to establish a right of return for Palestinians who currently reside in different countries around the world, with the result of making the Jews a minority in Israel, and therefore usher in its end as a Jewish state. This is what is in the BDS, the Palestinian BDS platform. And it's important that we be aware of that if we're going to consider, being involved, supporting this BDS movement. Many who have commented on the Palestinian BDS platform have pointed to it as, and I quote, the antithesis of a call for peace and reconciliation between two people in a compromise situation, unquote. One of the founders of the BDS movement, Omar Barghouti, a prominent leader in the Palestinian people, explicitly said when interviewed, and I quote from the interview, "We definitely oppose a Jewish state in any part of Palestine. I am completely and categorically against binationalism because it assumes there are two nations with equal moral claims to the land." End quote. His vision as the creator, the founder of the Palestinian BDS movement, the BDS movement we know today, his vision is, and I quote again, "For the right to return to 1948 lands and the creation of one secular and democratic state for all those living in historic Palestine." I need to unpack this for us because there is so much code language here that we need to really understand what the vision of the BDS movement is under the auspices of Omar Barghouti as its leader and founder. He says that his vision is for the right to return to the 1948 lands, the land as it was in 1948. That means when that is being shared and expressed, and we will see that in many other instances of Palestinians wanting the return to the 1948 lands, it means before the creation of the State of Israel. That's what it means. Which means it seeks to negate the State of Israel. It still seeks to return to a time before Israel ever existed. It seeks, in fact, through these words, the right of return to 1948 lands, it seems to basically erase Israel. That's what it says. And to create that, the second part of his vision, one secular and democratic state for those living in historic Palestine. Again, you can hear from what's not there that it's calling from one Palestinian state, supposedly secular and democratic, but not a shared, right? It's not a two-state solution here. It's a one-state solution that omits the fact that there are Jews there. Again, it's coming from a person who is at war, right? Who believes itself to be at war with Israel. So is it or is it not anti-Semitic? Coming from someone who clearly is stating that its goal and the goal of the BDS movement is to basically win this war against Israel and eradicate the state of Israel, as countries at war with each other, would want to do, right? You don't invade another country to keep it autonomous. You conquer to conquer, right? Nevertheless, here we have the leader of the BDS movement telling us as clearly and plainly as it gets what the purpose of the movement is. Now we have to ask ourselves, knowing this, whether it is a movement we want to be a part of or not. Now, of course, the problem comes when non-Palestinian individuals, not just individuals, but also institutions, entities, adopt the BDS platform and therefore side with the Palestinians in not only in their definition of Israel, but also in their goals and in their stated opposition to its existence. Again, as an institution, if you're going to adopt the BDS platform, as many have, as an individual, if you're going to support the BDS movement, then you are de facto siding and agreeing and supporting the Palestinians in their definition of Israel, in their goals, and in their opposition to the existence of Israel altogether. That is what you are embracing. So, for example, if, as we see too often here in America, academic circles, universities, coming to adopt, for example, the first goal of the BDS platform through their institutions in boycotting all Israeli academic professors, speakers, right? As part of embracing that first goal of boycott, right? Those institutions basically defund or bar any Israeli academic to come and speak at their university. Now the question is, since the message is, since the first platform, the first goal of the platform is to boycott all Israeli products and also all Israeli intellectuals for participating and being invited anywhere. Does that mean, if you follow the statement as written, that those American universities, institutions, not only American, but European as well, do they also equally boycott Israelis that are Israeli professors that are Muslims then? Because there are many Israeli Muslim professors. Do they also boycott Israeli Christians or Druze scholars who in fact are employed and teach at Israeli institutions, at Israeli universities all over Israel? So is there, because of their, let's say, quote unquote, affiliation as employees, as professors in Israeli institutions, are your local American university also barring the Druze, the Muslims, the Christian scholars from coming? Or, and it's important for us to ask that question, is this uniquely targeted at Jews? And if it is, then it becomes obviously anti-Semitic. Now, when, let's say, a university is just considering inviting Israeli professors of all background, by the way, to be considered, if they are at all considered for, let's say, a speaking engagement. Oftentimes we find that these Israeli professors, as a condition for their speaking at universities, are asked to officially and publicly denounce their, and I quote, government support of apartheid policies as a precondition for any invitation to speak. So here you are. You could be a left-wing Israeli professor, which most of them are, by the way, and still disagree philosophically on the ground of historical ground, political ground, all grounds, still very much disagree with the statement, and as we will talk about that in a moment, that Israel is an apartheid state, which is not just an extreme position to take, but it also is, as we will see, absolutely false. And if you think it's only in academic circles, you know, when universities are considering inviting this speaker or that speaker, well, think again. It's happening actually all over the place, and it's happening at many different areas of our lives. And I'm going to just give you one example, which is very radical in my book, but I think it exemplifies what we're dealing with. In 2015, American singer Matisyahu, I'm sure everybody has heard of Matisyahu, is a Jewish Matisyahu. That was his stage name. A Jewish rap singer. He actually was a Chabadnik. So when he performed, he had the long beard, he had the black hat. He's a Chabad person. He's moved away from that, but at the time that was his MO. That was who he was. Matisyahu was disinvited from appearing in Spain at an international reggae music festival after pressure from BDS members of the festival organizers, unless he made a public statement in support of Palestinian statehood and against Israeli war crimes. That was the condition under which he would be accepted to come sing at a reggae festival. Paradoxically, the festival's stated aims were, and I quote, to examine the rise of Islamophobia in the Western world and the treatment, in 2015, and the treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. That was the stated goal of the purpose of the concert, of the event, right? To examine the rise of Islamophobia in the Western world and the treatment of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. Now, no European or American singer, other than Matisyahu, was asked to denounce expressions of Islamophobia in their countries, or to denounce, for the other American singers invited, the treatment of Muslims at Guantanamo Bay. None of them were asked to do that as a condition of them being invited to the event. And that difference in treatment, that is anti-Semitic. The sad thing is that what the BDS movement is misguidedly doing is alienate the people, the very people who might otherwise be allies to their cause. It bars Israeli or altogether Jews, professors, intellectuals, who would want to advocate for change from participating in the larger conversation with hopefully like-minded Palestinian individuals. And so instead of facilitating those fruitful conversations toward peace and understanding by professors and intellectuals and people who could make a difference and influence and have influence in their respective countries. Instead, the BDS movement, by barring and excluding any of those conversations to be ever able to take place, the BDS movement is empowering extremists and extremism on both sides. It is erasing any possibility of fruitful academic engagement between Palestinians and Israelis, for example, that really could be the key to resolving this conflict, to resolving this situation. And so this punishment, right, this exclusion, stop all possibility of communication, shut down the most and shuts down the most moderate voices. Those we need the most. And what BDS does is that it assumes that all those associated with Israeli institution of any shape or form, even associated remotely with the state of Israel, that everybody hold a singular view, and that view is anti-Palestinian, that view is whatever the accusations are. It lumps everybody under one completely distorted view. And so all those left-wing Israelis, all of those Jewish intellectuals and academics, because of the BDS movement, have found themselves blacklisted. And this blacklisting is what we have seen here in America in the 1950s, where men and women were fired from jobs in academia and also the entertainment industry, accused as they were for being past members of the Communist Party. Deborah Lipstadt, in her book, writes, and I quote, "How ironic it is that leftist BDS supporters have adopted the tactics of right-wing McCarthyites." I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. The right-wing supporters of McCarthyism, right? They've adopted the same tactics. Now, I want to take a moment here to address the issue of calling Israel an apartheid state, because that is very important. I'm going to add a book to our collection. I know last week I introduced you to Deborah Lipstadt and Barry Weiss and Dennis Prager, Joseph Telushkin's books. But I want to add another book to your collection. This one is pretty thick, so it might take you, a few days to read through it. But I think it's a really good, really great book to understand what I'm talking about as it is relating to Israel. It's by Carrie Nelson, and it is called Israel Denial. I'm reading it backwards, so anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and the faculty campaign, so the universities, the faculty campaign against the Jewish state. And it's not just in America, it's in Europe, it's in England, but really incredibly well documented, really good book to add to your collection. I know I'm piling them on to your bookshelf, but if you really want to understand that, what's going on with that, those are very very important tools to have. So let's talk about this accusation of Israel as an apartheid state. Originating in South Africa, the term apartheid denotes, at least according to my dictionary, because I went and looked it up, I quote, a rigid policy of segregating and economically and politically oppressing the non-white population, or more generally, any system or practice that separates people according to color, ethnicity, caste, etc., etc. Right? Looking at the second half of this definition, any system or practice that separates people according to color, ethnicity, caste, and so on. If you just look at that part of the definition, we could say that maybe we could look at America itself, right? And say that maybe America could be defined as an apartheid state. I mean, we've been talking the last few years about the systemic racism in America. And we know that our cities, I mean, those of us who live in Seattle, know very well that we have separate neighborhoods, even though it's not official, but we know that this, in fact, is the case. So, we could say, if we look at this definition, that, in fact, America, as many Western countries in the world who have major struggles with the minorities, would qualify under that definition. And in the former part of the definition, the one that specifically applied to South Africa, the apartheid state of South Africa, this was really a state that had a white minority rule over a 90% non-white population. That is not the case in Israel. Not by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. So that's just, we start with definitions because we have to start somewhere. Now, there's going. I'm gonna talk about all the issues here, right? There, Arabs, Muslims or Christian Arabs, who live in the parts of the West Bank still under Israeli military occupation, right? As opposed to the Palestinian autonomous territories. And I'm going to share a map with you in just a moment, because I think it's important for us. So there are Palestinians in the West Bank that live directly under Israeli military occupation, but more Palestinians in the West Bank live under Palestinian rule, right? But I'm talking about just the Palestinians who live under Israeli military occupation in the West Bank right now. They are subject to military rule, military tribunals, and all of the accoutrement and administrative institutions that come with a military government, if you'd like, a military rule. So the Palestinians who live in those territories are not under the democratic umbrella of the Jewish state, which means that those Palestinians who live there don't benefit from the rights and privileges and protections of that Israeli Arabs benefit from under Israeli civil law, under Israeli democratic law. Now, this is where I want to share the map with you, because I think it's very important for us to know what it is we are talking about. And nothing can explain that better than just seeing it with our own eyes. So this is the part of the map of Israel as it exists today. In the bright green is where the Israeli democratic government is established. Okay? The strip of Gaza that you see on the bottom left corner, right? Gaza that, from their northern border sends missiles into Tel Aviv, into Ashdod, into Ashkelon, and all of those parts of Israel. Gaza is under, as you read in the legend, full Palestinian control. The only part that is still to be negotiated is really the border with Egypt, where Israel keeps military presence both offshore and on land to prevent smuggling of arms and missiles into the Gaza Strip, that would be used against Israel. So there is a self-defense purpose for Israeli forces still maintaining the border with Egypt, and also keeping an eye on the waters of the Mediterranean Sea to avoid any supply of armaments to come into Gaza. They are more or less successful, as we see, because every so many months or years, the Hamas, who is the terrorist organization ruling in the Gaza Strip, the Hamas manages to find somehow batteries of missiles to fire at Israel. Now let's look at the West Bank. The West Bank is the kidney bean here. And in purple on the right is Jordan. So the West Bank is called the West Bank because it's on the west side of the Jordan River that basically is dividing Israel, the kidney bean of the West Bank, and the Jordanian state, which again is in purple. So it is the West Bank of the Jordan River, and that West Bank, until 1967, belonged to Jordan. Right? Understand that there never was a Palestinian state because in 1948, the Palestinians rejected the partition plan because they never wanted to have a Jewish state there. And they, as well as Jordan, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and even Saudi Arabia, immediately attacked Israel to destroy Israel in the first few hours of its existence in order to never have and erase from the start any Jewish state in that region. At the end of the war, Jordan had conquered the West Bank, and that became part of the state of Jordan, which from 1948/49 and until 1967 never sought, for whatever reason, never sought to remove their troops from the kidney bean, from the West Bank, and make that a Palestinian autonomous state. For some reason, and we would have to see what the politics of that were at the time, that never became, and there never was any pressure on the Jordanian government to de facto create a Palestinian state by just removing their troops from their occupation of that land. Nowadays, and after peace agreements between the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who is now the leading party, political party in the West Bank, Israel removed their troops from all the areas in the kidney bean that are in a dark brown. All of those areas, which include the most populated areas of Palestinian towns and cities, all of those are under the direct rule and management of Palestinians themselves. Area B, which are the kind of yellowish ochre areas around those, are still under Palestinian administration, but Israel provides security. Israel has still its soldiers there. This is where you would have, people manning roadblocks and checking people in and out. And Area C, which is the white part, which if you know Israel, on the right side going to the Jordanian and the Dead Sea, are mostly desert. There are really very few, if anybody living there, besides nomads, Bedouins who still inhabit the parts of the desert. And Israel also is maintaining, obviously, some space between Palestinians and the Greens in the green zone for security reasons as well. And Israel also has not negotiated the relinquishing of the white space at the border with Jordan, because they feel that for safety and security reason, they still need to be the ones manning that border. Okay. So I'm going to leave the map up for a few moments. Now the problem, of course, that Israel still occupies, as you can see on the map, I would say the majority of the overwhelming majority of the land, not the places where people necessarily live, but of the land in the West Bank, right? And Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, the founder of the state of Israel, Ben-Gurion himself warned that if Israel maintains its occupation of the West Bank in perpetuity, right, creating the de facto, really a Jewish one state from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the Jordan River, then effectively it would turn the occupation of the West Bank, right, if Palestinians were not granted full civil rights and citizenship, meaning if that territory remained under military occupation, it would turn, in fact, the West Bank to a form of apartheid, especially if gated Jewish settlements continue to eat out at pre-1967 Jordanian territory. So I'm going to remove the map. I can put it up again later if we're talking about this again. But the point is that every passing year that no peaceful settlement of the conflict is arrived at makes it less and less tenable for Israel to claim it is still at war with the Palestinians and therefore justify its military occupation. And it's going to be, and it's getting more and more difficult year after year to avoid that apartheid label when it comes to the West Bank. We know that there may be some conversations going on right now, so maybe there is hope that something will come out of the latest opening that we are seeing there. Now, paradoxically, and it's also very important to understand, every escalating military conflict, for example, between Hamas and Israel, as happened this past spring, supports Israel's justification of maintaining its military control of the West Bank. Why? I'll talk about that in a moment. But before I talk about that, the fact that the Hamas feels itself pulled to, let's say, attacking Israel begs the question as to what Hamas, which is in control of Gaza, right? What Hamas aims to achieve in a conflict that clearly it cannot win. It is clear that the purpose of those missiles being showered over Israel is not going to cause the state of Israel to topple, to wave the white flag and say, you won, invade us, we cannot withstand your military power. Hamas knows that full well. So what is their goal if it's not to achieve victory over Israel? We need to ask ourselves these questions. Each wave of military exchange only radicalizes people further on both sides. And who benefits from that? Those who prop up and promote the most extreme positions. Those like the Hamas, because they keep the radicals like the Hamas in power. There's nothing more beneficial for the Hamas at the time when things seem to be getting better in the Gaza Strip than attack Israel so that it can it can strengthen itself anew as the one defender of the Palestinian people, right? It keeps them in power. And many political observers have suggested that Hamas's goal in forever postponing the peace process. I mean, if you notice, Hamas's attacks Israel any opportunity it gets when Israel starts to talk to the PLO, to the leadership in the West Bank. Why? Because its goal, it's in forever postponing the peace process by regularly attacking Israel to keep itself in power in Gaza and also win the hearts of disaffected West Bank Palestinians currently ruled by the leadership of the PLO. So, and this is extremely complicated. It has multiple layers of political infighting within the Palestinians themselves. There is this position jockeying of rogue states like Iran, who are fueling the conflict, not only by selling arms to the Hamas or to other Palestinian terrorist organizations, but also training Palestinian terrorist groups in order to have them wage a war of proxy against Israel. So that Iran doesn't have to attack Israel, they just sacrifice those radicalized Palestinians to their cause and their interests. So we have to also understand that there are so many moving pieces in the Middle East, that there are multiple war by proxy that are happening between the different states in the Middle East, but also between the Palestinian organizations themselves. And so Israel, the government of Israel, who is looking at the big picture, because Israel knows who are the players in the game and knows what's going on between the Palestinians, who know what's going on between Iran, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Syria, and their interest of continuing to attack Israel, if not directly, then through the Hezbollah, for example, in Lebanon, through Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and all other Jihad Islamic and all other radical organizations. Israel looks at all of this and thinks to itself, as I think most governments in that situation would, is less and less inclined to turn the West Bank over to the Palestinians, fearing that it will become the next Gaza Strip, wherefrom rockets would rain freely in Western Jerusalem, or in fact, in any town or city anywhere in Israel. I mean, look at the map again. Just look at the map again and put yourself in the shoes of the Israeli government. We have here, I think you can see my mouse, but you have here in the strip of Gaza, radical Islamic terrorist organization that are raining missiles on the closest towns north of them, Ashkelon and Ashdod, and we've seen in the last conflict that can reach all the way to Tel Aviv. I know because my daughter was there and I was very aware what was going on at the time. Now imagine if the kidney bean now becomes completely under Palestinian leadership and rule, and the moderate, which is a paradox to think of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, who was the greatest terrorist organization led by Yasser Arafat for many decades, is now actually politically the most moderate wing of the Palestinian people. And they have their own problems. Nobody's perfect. But imagine if the Hamas was to actually politically overthrow the PLO, which is absolutely possible, and turn the kidney bean of the West Bank into another Gaza. Is there any town in Israel that you can look at right now that would not be, I mean, look at Jerusalem, that would not be under direct fire from any kind of rocket coming from there? Is there any way you believe, looking at this map, that it would be sustainable for Jews to still live in Israel if the West Bank became another Gaza Strip? Do you think, as the Israeli government, you're looking at that, you're looking at Iran sponsoring and financing and arming all of those terrorist organizations, Saudi Arabia, Syria, the Hezbollah in Lebanon, who would just love to have that happen in Israel? Do you think about it from an Israeli perspective? So Israelis are trading very carefully. And people who, maybe BDS supporters don't understand what's going on the ground. What's happening in the Middle East. Don't understand the multi-layers of this protracted conflict that involved not just the Israelis and the Palestinians in the West Bank, but it involves all other Muslim countries around. It's extremely complicated. Extremely complicated. So, yes, the peace process is a process that is taking a long time, and Israel is going to want to have 1,000, 1,000,000 guarantees for its security before it relinquishes more and more of those territories. Of course. And right now, the problem that Israel is seeing is that both at home, like in the land and around the land, and abroad, in America and Europe, the voices that are winning are the voices of radicalization, of extremism against the Jewish people and against Israel. So when someone accuses Israel to be creating de facto an apartheid state with the West Bank, ask them, if you are confronted by somebody who is making this claim, ask them what they know about the political situation in the Middle East. Ask them. And ask them, if they say they do, what their solution is to the conflict. Ask them. It's just as simple as that. Ask them. And if they come back with, as I would suspect many will, it's all Israel's fault, and the Palestinians are the do no wrong sole victims of oppression, and they continue by saying, if only Israel did not exist, all will be well in the Middle East, you will then know that you are talking to an ignorant anti-Semite. Simple. Now, what about the Arabs, Christians, and Muslims who are living in the democratic state of Israel, in the green area? What about them, you may ask? Are they victims of an apartheid regime? And here the answer is much clearer and is a resounding absolutely not. In this case, the label is not only inaccurate, it is downright offensive, and it's often used to delegitimize and denigrate Israel as a whole. Moreover, the use of this very inaccurate and highly charged label is also counterproductive. It is also counterproductive because it doesn't support resolving the issues related to acknowledge injustices within Israeli society. There is no doubt that Israel, like every democratic country, has tremendous societal challenges and must do better in dealing with issues of institutionalized bias, discrimination, inequity, and racism. No doubt, Israel has the same problems we have here. Exactly. Different setting, different place, different history, but we as democracies are dealing with those issues. Institutionalized bias, discrimination, inequity, and racism. It's everywhere. And so let's not just make Israel the only place where that exists. It's everywhere. And that exists, that is true of non-Jewish citizens as much actually in Israel as it is true of Jewish minorities themselves. You know, including, I don't know if you're aware of that, including a decades-old conflict between Ashkenazi and Sephardi Mizrahi communities in Israel, right? And within Israel, there are safeguards aimed at ensuring the equal treatment of all citizens, Jewish or not Jewish, Muslims, Christians. Israeli laws and democratic institutions of Israel are extremely robust, extremely strong, and they include a fully independent court and a very strong, very opinionated free press. And all of those align to uphold and speak out for these rights. That's important to know. That's Israel. That's the truth of Israel. Israeli Arab citizens, who are 20% of Israel's population, serve as judges, ambassadors, they are legislators, they are journalists. I mentioned they are professors, they are artists, and they play prominent roles in all aspects of Israeli society. This is not apartheid like we talked about when we talked about South Africa. And on top of that, for the first time as of June of 2021, there is an Islamist Arab political party who is a partner in the current governing coalition of the State of Israel. There is no correlation whatsoever between the plight of the non-white majority under South Africa's apartheid and Israel. None. And I want to state that as loudly as I can. Because more often than not, choosing to apply the apartheid label is meant to question the legitimacy of the world's only Jewish state and its continued existence. That is what underlies this accusation. So again, one must ask, what purpose is served by the accusation of apartheid? What is the accuser's goal? Is it to challenge and change specific policies of a given Israeli government? Or is it to demonize the entire state of Israel, or to advocate for its disappearing? We have to ask those questions. Those are important questions. What is the goal? What is the purpose? And that is exactly, in fact, what brings me back to our BDS conversation, which I've taken a little detour here. Because I think we have to separate the BDS movement itself, as I described it at the beginning, with many of its, I believe, well-meaning but ignorant followers. Because many BDS supporters are happy to criticize specific actions of the Israeli government. There is nothing wrong with that. We can do that. If that's what we're doing, we can do that. Americans, you and me, we can be criticizing other governments' policies. We can be criticizing, we have the right to criticize Russia and Russia's policies. We have the right, and we do, criticize China's policy and talk about being a racist country. We have the right, and we do, criticize from time to time when our economic assets are not too much at risk. We criticize Saudi Arabia for its treatment of its minorities, of its women, and its harsh policies against its gay and lesbian population, this LGBTQ population. Just like many other countries, believe it or not, are sharp critiques of American government policies. I mean, it's hard to believe because we are so perfect, but it's true. Other countries criticize this government or that government policy. And it's fair game. It's fine. That's what we do. So these BDS supporters believe that their thus voiced criticism, this protest movement, will result in Israel's relinquishing of the West Bank, which will then, together with Gaza, become the state of Palestine, able to peacefully exist alongside the state of Israel, and everyone will live happily ever after. The problem is that those well-intentioned BDS supporters have not seriously examined BDS's founding documents or one of its founders, Omar Barghouti's statements, as I have shared them with you. Because if they had, they would have found that these documents, the stated objectives of the BDS movement is the dissolution of Israel as a Jewish state. Because that is what would occur if more than 7 million Palestinians who are currently living around the world were permitted to exercise their right of return. When return is, again, to the pre-1948, meaning pre-Israel lands of Palestine. Those, however, who are literal anti-Israel activists take matters further in propagating the Arab and Russian charge, by the way, of Zionism is racism. And we'll talk about that in a different session. Right? The charge that Zionism is racism. It's got to do with the UN. It was voted as a UN platform, and it was taken down 20 years later. But still, that mantra, Zionism is racism, is very often branded about and used to accuse Israel of all the ills in the world. When you and I know, because we've seen this together in a previous session, that Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jews, that culminated in the creation of Israel in 1948, marking the end of Zionism as a movement, right? Once the movement created what it was aimed to create, which is the state of Israel in 1948, then the movement itself is retired because now we have the state of Israel. So Americans can and do criticize the horrendous policies of China, of Saudi Arabia, of Russia, and other anti-democratic nations, and that's important to note, anti-democratic nations around the world, both personally, individually. We can protest, we can demonstrate, and also we can put pressure on our government to do the same. But never at any point, despite the most horrendous acts of these so-named three countries, do we ever question Russia's or China's or Saudi Arabia's right to exist. Neither have we ever called for their dissolution, for their disappearing. And those are, unlike Israel, democratic countries who have a rap sheet of oppression that is, as long as the Torah itself. To argue that only Jews are not permitted to have a national home, only Jews, is to deny Jewish peoplehood. And this negation of Jewish nationhood is a form of anti-Semitism. Period. That only Israel is slated for eradication is anti-Semitism. When we will see BDS movements attacking China for its treatment of its Muslim minorities, the Uyghur, and asking, therefore, the dissolution of the state of China, then we could say, okay, maybe if it's equal opportunity accusing, then that's fine. But that never happens. That never happens. It could have been debated, and it was, by the way, before 1948, it was, whether it was a good or a bad idea to establish a Jewish state in the Middle East. But to advocate now, 73 years after its founding, for the dissolution of a state that is now home to 7 million people, constitute an unprecedented demand for an existing democratic state. I mean, we're, in this case, we're not asking Israel to change its policies. We're asking for it to disappear. And this is so outrageous that its promoters, understanding that it is easier to oppose a movement than to call for the end of a nation state, have strategically positioned themselves not as opponents of Israel, like direct opponents of Israel, but opponent to Zionism. Zionism. And so they are reviving a movement that ended in 1948 as a way to make believe that the Jewish project for national liberation and independence is still ongoing when it's not, right? Because it hasn't been for 73 years. But if it is made to believe that it's an ongoing movement, therefore, it is still debatable. Therefore, it is still open for questioning. It is still open for criticism. Do you see why they are using the word Zionism all the time? Because they're not attacking Israel, but they're attacking the movement, and they're making us believe that it still exists. And if it still exists, therefore it can be attacked. And so they equate this false definition with the oppression of the Palestinians. And they drew false equivalencies, saying that Zionism is the ongoing perpetration of genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. The reality on the ground is that there is a conflict between, a territorial conflict between two people. What the BDS movement is doing by, in fact, attacking Zionism is that it's saying that Zionism continues, and the way Zionism continues is through they call the genocide, the ongoing genocide and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people, which is absolutely false. There is no genocide, nor is there an ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. In fact, the Palestinian population is growing leaps and bounds. So if Israel was, was perpetrating a genocide against the Palestinian people, they are the worst at trying to do anything like that. Because in fact, the Palestinian people is growing. So we see that ultimately the BDS movement is neither about boycott, nor is it about divestment, or is it about sanctions. The actual goal is only covertly stated. It is to convince would-be supporters that Israel is the sole impediment for peace in the Middle East, if not the world, by the way. And so this myopic focus on Israel as the one and only guilty party, at the exclusion of the criticizing, not just of Palestinian actions, by the way, because, they're not just angels, but of any minority oppressing Muslim country, as there are many, and I named just a few earlier in the world, that is anti-Semitic. That is anti-Semitic. Besides, the critics are not specific to this or that Israeli government policies, but they generalize and they hold as guilty by association all Israelis. Which it's enraging, because it would be the equivalent of saying that all Americans were guilty of the policies of the Trump administration. Can we imagine? If there were accusation putting all Americans as guilty of the Trump administration's policies, how would we feel about that? Those of us who did not vote for Trump. Those who voted for Trump, maybe they would say, yeah. But those of us, and according to the, to the exit polls, the majority of Americans did not vote for Trump. How would we feel if that was the kind of accusation that was thrown at us? And so this kind of generalization is de facto, by definition, anti-Semitic. Mark Yukov, Y-U-K-O-V, is the president emeritus of the University of California. And he wrote, and I quote, "Their rhetoric," so the rhetoric of the harsh, the radical BDS supporters, their rhetoric corrupts the language of human rights and expropriates the words historically used to demean the Jews, focusing instead on the Jewish state. For example, Israeli soldiers are accused of deliberately killing women and poisoning wells in Palestinian territories. Poisoning wells, does that sound? Yes, it does. Middle Ages. He continues, "In an age of exquisite sensitivity on many campuses to microaggression, or to language that subtly offends underrepresented groups, the ironic toleration of microaggression against the Jews goes often, more than often, unnoticed. Again, there are those who support the BDS movement who genuinely believe that it will lead to Israel changing those policies that adversely affect Palestinians, as by the way, a sizable percentage of Israeli voters are working to do every election that comes around, right? I mean, we have to understand that as well, that in Israel there is a sizable group of Israelis who are working and voting and protesting and actively involved in changing those policies. It's not like Israelis are just, sitting by and waiting for the next government to do something about it, right? Just like us, we voted, we vote are the governments that don't work for us out of office, right? Israelis do the same. That's why it's a democracy. And Palestinians, as a sizable percentage of Israeli voters, are also, in conjunction with and in hand in hand with Jewish Israelis, are all voting and working to change the government and to change the policies. Those of us who have been in Israel and have seen this on the ground, we know that's happening. But for those extreme BDS supporters, the movement they support holds singular and imbalanced views of Israel and support its dissolution of the Jewish state. So there are ways to work to achieve peace between Israelis and Palestinians. There are ways to do that. And they are great organizations right here in America that are dedicated to doing just that. Both Palestinian organizations here in America and Jewish organizations here in America. And so instead of, I would suggest, supporting the BDS movement that only exacerbates the situation and really radicalizes position, when what we need is the exact opposite, I would suggest that we go out of our way to find those organizations, Jewish and Muslim, Palestinians or not, that support the peace process. We, you and me, should do that. We should do that in person. We should do that financially. We should do that. We should support anyone who's working towards peace, wherever we find them, really. And BDS is not the way. Now, I'm almost there, but I will go over the 8:30 timeline. Because I want to talk about what we often hear, that the BDS movement is not anti-Semitic because, so many of its supporters are Jews, right? We have, for example, the Jewish Voice for Peace organization, who is a BDS supporting organization, as just an example. On the other side of that divide are those who are accusing these BDS Jewish supporters as self-hating Jews, which is a term that is as unhelpful as it is inaccurate. It's often the case that one of the most insidious results of prejudice is when members of a persecuted group accept the ugly stereotypes used to characterize them. And we saw that a few weeks ago, if you remember, when I talked about the leadership of the Jewish Enlightenment back in the 17 and 1800s, if you remember. We call that the Haskalah movement, right? And those leaders swallowed whole all of the accusations of mostly the non-Jewish Germans who said we can't have the Jews become Germans because they need to be re-educated, they have to be uplifted because they are backward, underdeveloped, feeble-minded people. And the leadership of the Jewish Enlightenment took on those stereotypes, agreed with them, and worked to answer them, right? So we know that people do that. We do that. We are susceptible to internalizing the critiques and the criticism of ourselves. Anthony Julius, he wrote that contempt for Jews, when sufficiently widespread, can foster self-contempt among Jews. Like we internalize our own critiques. And it can convince Jews that even unfounded and inaccurate accusations leveled against them, or by extension to the Jewish people, or to the Jewish state in this case, are in fact true. So many anti-Zionist Jews who are even opposed to Israel's existence believe that they are expressing universalistic Jewish values such as support for the downtrodden, for the victims of injustice, and so on and so forth. And so many have bought into the anti-Israel narrative and consider themselves, in fact, the most courageous, most woke, most evolved in their opposition to the self-deluded, ethnocentric, omnipotent, my country, right or wrong, organized Jewry, right? So we, the BDS supporters, are the most woke, the most evolved, but the Jewish mainstream, organized organizations are ethnocentric, they are self-deluded, and they follow my country, right or wrong kind of policy. As if that was true. As if that was true. So those Jews who profess those kind of ideas are not anti-Semitic, though. Even though they have clearly internalized these anti-Semitic motifs. But even if they're not anti-Semites themselves, they facilitate the spread of anti-Semitism. They are part of the problem. They are part of the spread of the BDS platform anti-Semitic core. And because BDS is part of anti-Israel radical Islam and the campaign against Israel, I want to close tonight talking for a few minutes about radical Islam today. Now, I talked about the source of radical Islam, and I covered that topic a few weeks ago, like the history of it, how we got to where we got, okay? But its expression today is what I want to quickly showcase right now. If for hundreds of years that distinction pertained to Christianity, today it is radical Islam that is exceptional in its animosity against the Jewish people. Some on the political right seek to cleanse Christianity of its bloody history toward Jews. And they argue, therefore, that Islam is an exceptionally violent creed. We hear that on the right. Because they want to cleanse themselves of their own violence against us, they, on the right, the political right, they point at the Muslims and they say, oh, these Muslims, they are exceptionally violent. In their creed, it's built in their beliefs, right? On the political left, we see those go to great pains to portray anti-Semitism as a uniquely Christian phenomenon, painting contemporary Islam as fundamental, as completely misunderstood. Right? So on one hand, on the right, everybody accuses Islam in order to cleanse themselves from their own guilt. On the left, they're going the other way. They're saying Islam is misunderstood. Anti-Semitism is uniquely Christian. And neither version is true. Neither version is true. Today, nowhere is the conspiracy theory that anti-Semitism is, as we saw, as we talked about definition last time. Nowhere is the conspiracy theory in which Jews spread evil in the world more widely believed and more publicly proclaimed than in the Muslim world. And as we've seen, traditional Islam is under threat. It has been destabilized by the process of colonization and then decolonization, of American imperialism, the rise of Western liberalism and globalization. All of those are blamed on the international Jew and typified in the guise of political Zionism and the State of Israel. As early, now we have to understand this comes as early as the case of Palestinians as 1933. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem made his support for the Nazis open and clear via German officials in Jerusalem. He met with Hitler himself in 1941, strengthening his ties to the Nazi regime and acting, and that's key, as their propaganda arm in the Middle East. There's a book by Jeffrey Herf, H-E-R-F, called Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World. I'm talking about this now because I want to share the roots of the theoretical roots. Nazi Propaganda for the Arab World. And he's quoted in Barry Weiss's book, where he shows how Nazism, combined with particular interpretation of Islam, produced a particularly toxic anti-Semitic brew. Nazi propaganda spread to Muslim lands in 1948 and the establishment of the State of Israel. As we've seen, the failure of all the Arab states to defeat Israel, in the bud, only supercharged the hostility against Jews and against Israelis. And so the radical Muslim argument can be summed up as this: the Jews are the agents of all modern evils. The Jews are the agents of all modern evils. Western civilization, nationalism, communism, feminism, and so on and so forth. They have been the enemies of Islam as far back as the 7th century, when we've seen in the Quran they fighted Muhammad. To return Islamic civilization to its true roots, the only real way to defeat the West is to defeat the Jews, the chief symbol of the West and of modernity. The Jews have to be wiped out. And I'm just using big words. If you listen to the leaders of Iran, they say that every other day. I'm not making it up. And then after the Israel's shocking victory in 1967, the Soviet Union began pumping its own malicious propaganda into the region. Russia was disappointed. The Soviet Union was very disappointed with Israel. The Soviet Union believed that, seeing the movement like the kibbutz and all of the institutions of the early state of Israel, all of those seemed to the Soviet very socialist by nature. A kibbutz is the quintessential, Soviet community, really. And so the Soviet Union saw in Israel the great promise to have a socialist/communist platform, beachhead in the Middle East. When, as Israel was created and evolved, it became clear that those ideas in the Soviet minds were betrayed by the turn of Israel towards the Western world and especially America. The Soviet Union became one of the really most voiceful enemy of Israel. And they began pumping its own propaganda against Israel all over the Middle East and began sending almost an unending flow of arms and munition into Egypt and other Muslim states in order, here again, to fight a proxy war against capitalism and the United States by attacking Israel. And that's why the Soviets introduced in the Union, in the UN, that definition. It was Soviet introduced of Zionism is racism, because that was part of their propaganda. That was part of how they wanted to rally the Muslim world to their cause and find in the Muslim world partners and attack, the Cold War, attack America through attacking Israel. The late scholar Fuad Ajami, Ajami, called the ideologies roiling the Middle East a malignant trilogy of anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, and anti-modernism. And that trilogy may be the historical result of Nazi propaganda, add to its Soviet communist propaganda and influence, and you have wrapped that in the tie that with the ribbon of radical Islamic interpretation of Islamic faith. You have a very explosive anti-Semitic bed right there in the Middle East. Bernard Lewis wrote this of the region's anti-Semitism, and I quote, "The volume of anti-Semitic books and articles published, the size and number of editions and impressions, the eminence and authority of those who write, publish, and sponsor them, their place in schools and college curriculum, their role in the mass media, would all seem to suggest that classical anti-Semitism is an essential part of Arab intellectual life at the present time, almost as much as happened in Nazi Germany, and considerably more than in late 19th century France," unquote. That's a pretty devastating statement. Fareed Zakaria wrote in the Washington Post just recently that anti-Semitism has truly, and I quote, "spread like a cancer throughout the Muslim world." And it doesn't come only from intellectuals, it comes from state leaders, popular movements, and politicians. Perhaps most potently, it comes from the press, on television and radio, in newspapers, and of course, through social media. End quote. In Egypt, in 2002, a 41-episode series ran during the month of Ramadan and was called, and you can check that out, I'm not making things up, Horseman Without a Horse. That was the name of that TV show, 41 episodes. The theme was the Zionist conspiracy to control the world, inspired, as the producers acknowledged themselves in their press releases, by the protocols of the elders of Zion. And according to the New York Times, an estimated 10 million people, 10 million Egyptians tuned in to watch the entire show. It was a smashing success. So these ideas are now traveling at the speed of light across borders and transnationally via the internet. If classical anti-Semitism once traveled from the west to the east, from the west to the east, today this brew of anti-Semitism, of anti-liberalism, of anti-America, and anti-Zionism is moving in the opposite direction. It has started to infect America, where the numbers of troubling incidents is growing. There was a video in April 2019 of an event at the Muslim American Society in Philadelphia, in which children were filmed singing, "We will chop off their heads and we will liberate the sorrowful and exalted Al-Aqsa Mosque. We will lead the army of Allah, fulfilling his promise, and we will subject them to eternal torture." That's here in America. Filmed in Philadelphia. Children singing that. The next month, Rabad Abdul Hadi, an Arab and Muslim ethnicities studies professor at San Francisco State University, gave a mandatory lecture to an anthropology class in which she reportedly said that anyone who supports Israel is a white supremacist. And I'm going to post in the Facebook page this atrocious and revolting anti-Semitic speech by Zara Bilu, just last November, who is the executive director of the San Francisco branch of the Islamic group CAIR, C-A-I-R, which stands for the Council of American Islamist Relation, which is a Hamas-affiliated anti-Semitic propaganda organization, where, by the way, Ilhan Omar has given many speeches. And this Zara Bilu, who you have to watch this, and your heart is going to break apart. It's atrocious. She was once one of the leaders of the Women's March, who declare in the speech, I'm giving it a little bit of away, who said in her speech to be very afraid of the polite Zionists. That's her words, the polite Zionists. She's talking about you and me. And their organizations, like the Jewish Federation, like Hillel, or like the ADL, that are the enemies of the Muslims, who will, and I quote again, will not be there for you when you need them, who will take your friendship and throw your Palestinian brothers and sisters under the bus. I will post this and the shortened Vimeo video of her speech in the Facebook page, and you'll see it's inconceivable, absolutely inconceivable. You know, the polite Zionists are actually, she's talking about those Jewish organizations who actually are working with Palestinians and Muslims to promote peace and reconciliation, right? So we are the polite Zionists, right? We have a double face, right? In the front we say one thing, but in the back we say something else. Okay, I'm looking at how much more to share. I think I'm going to stop here. I think that's already enough overwhelming information, and it's good to just stay in America. I was going to talk about what's going on in Europe with the issues around the BDS movement, but there is too much to cover, and I think Dayenu, that's enough for one night. I will be posting some interesting articles, you know, especially on what's going on in Europe, so that you can read it between now and next week, and we don't have to stay here any longer. Thank you for for adding 15 minutes to our 8:30 time, and to bear with me. I don't think we have questions. We have time for questions, unfortunately. We're gonna end with a Shalom Chant. I'm gonna stop the video, and I'm gonna stop the live streaming. If you want to stay a few minutes, I'm happy to leave space for questions. I'm happy to stay another 15 minutes or so, if there are anything is burning. If not, you can just email me, rabbi.olivier@betalef, betalef.org, and I'm happy to answer any question you may have. But let's close this with a Shalom Chant, with gratitude for your ongoing presence and support. And then we'll let everybody go, and we can stay together on Zoom if there are a question or two. Just taking a moment to find our breath again. And if you want to chant with me, take a breath now for Shalom. Thank you. Next week I have invited the regional director of the ADL to come and talk to us for 30-40 minutes about what's going on, what is the work the ADL is doing right now, and especially what is the state of anti-Semitism right here in the Northwest. And then the second half of that session will talk about anti-Semitism on the political right here in America. So it's going to be another pretty mind-expanding session next week. I'm going to say goodnight to all of you who are watching this live stream, and I'll stay on for a few minutes for anyone who wants to stick around. Good night.